Ika, huh? Kind of a haunting title, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It just grabs you right from the start.
Right. It means like how. And it's that very word that kicks off the whole Book of Lamentations, the KJV version specifically, which is what you, our listener, asked about. So we're going deep on that today.
And there's so much packed into that one word, isn't there? Ika. It's raw, it's questioning, it gets right to the heart of this deep, deep sorrow and just the bewilderment in the face of just immense tragedy.
Yeah, for sure. So for anyone out there who maybe hasn't spent much time with Lamentations, what exactly are we talking about here?
Okay, so think of it like this. It's a collection of these incredibly intense poems, and they're all expressions of grief, like really raw cries of grief.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, really heavy. And the grief is specifically over the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, way back in 586 BC.
We'll put out some great source material to work with today, by the way, that goes into all the details of this book, its place in the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's a powerful part of the biblical narrative.
Definitely. And today, our goal isn't just to recap the history. We want to go deeper than that. We want to explore the context, like what was going on that led to these poems, and also appreciate them as works of art, how they're written. And of course, we've got to get into the theological meaning too. What does it all mean? Right.
Right. Because it really is a journey into this profound crisis, both historically and spiritually, and how people of faith responded to such a just unimaginable loss.
Okay, so let's go back to that title. You said Acres pops up at the beginning of more than one chapter, right?
Yeah, it does. You see it in chapters 1, 2, and 4.
So it's not just a random thing, right? What's the deeper meaning there?
No, it's definitely intentional. I think it's meant to emphasize the persistent state of shock and disbelief, like an open wound that just won't heal. Or maybe a better way to say it is, it's like this fundamental question that keeps echoing in the face of just overwhelming loss. And, in the Jewish tradition, there's another title they use, Kinot.
Kinot.
Yeah, it means Lamentations. Simple as that, really. This title just zeroes in on the content and the genre, and it was picked up by the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. Those are early Greek and Latin translations of the Old Testament.
Okay, so both titles get at the core of the book, right? Like that initial cry of pain and then the form it takes. So who wrote it, this incredibly moving book?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. The Book of Lamentations itself, it doesn't actually say who the author is.
Oh, really? No name at all?
Nope. But there's this really strong and ancient tradition, both in Jewish and early Christian circles, that it was the prophet Jeremiah.
Okay, so why Jeremiah? It's not just a random guess, is it? What's the logic there?
Well, there are a few things. First, there's this passage in 2 Chronicles 35.25, and it mentions Jeremiah writing laments for King Josiah's death. Now, those laments, we don't know for sure if they're what became the Book of Lamentations.
Right.
But it does show us that Jeremiah worked in this form, in this genre of writing. And then there's also just the style, the way the language is used, the vocabulary. It's similar to other things we know Jeremiah wrote.
So similar themes, similar ways of expressing them. Makes sense.
Yeah, if you're living through the same crazy times, dealing with the same kinds of spiritual questions, it's going to come out in your writing, right?
For sure.
And then there's another really compelling point. Jeremiah actually witnessed everything that's described in Lamentations. I mean, he was right there during the siege and fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And the descriptions are so vivid, so raw, so emotionally powerful, you really get the sense that whoever wrote this was actually there, experiencing it all firsthand. It's like immediate trauma pouring out onto the page.
Wow. So yeah, strong case for Jeremiah.
Definitely plausible.
But the material you sent says we can't be totally sure. Why is that? I mean, it seems like a pretty good fit.
Well, scholars like to be careful, and even though tradition points to Jeremiah, the book itself doesn't actually say his name.
Right, right.
So, maybe it was someone really close to Jeremiah, someone who shared his views. Or maybe it was a collection of different laments from that time that later got attributed to him because he was such a prominent figure. We can't know for sure.
Makes sense.
What we can say with more confidence is the rough time period when it was probably written.
Okay, so when are we talking? When was Lamentations written?
Well, the earliest possible date would be right after the destruction in 586 BC.
Makes sense.
And the latest, maybe around 516 BC, when the Second Temple was dedicated.
Okay.
But like I said, the descriptions are so vivid, so immediate, that most scholars think it was probably written closer to the events themselves, maybe before 575 BC, when those memories were still really fresh and raw.
Yeah, you can almost feel the pain leaping off the page.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the structure of Lamentations, like the actual way it's written.
Oh yeah, the poetry itself.
The material you sent talks about its poetic structure, and it's actually really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Because here's you have all this incredibly powerful emotion, this intense grief, but it's contained within this very deliberate and intricate structure.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, the first, second, fourth, and fifth laments, they all have exactly 22 verses.
22. Okay, that's got to mean something.
It definitely does. 22 corresponds to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet.
Whoa. So it's like the alphabet itself is framing the whole experience.
Exactly. It's a very intentional literary choice. And then there's also the fact that the first four laments use an acrostic structure.
Okay, hold on. Acrostic, remind me what that is.
Sure, so an acrostic poem is where the first letter of each line spells out a word or a phrase. In this case, in chapters 1, 2, and 4, each verse starts with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
So the first verse starts with Aleph, the second with Beth, and so on.
You got it. It's like they're using the very building blocks of their language to express this profound sense of loss.
That's really powerful, actually. Like, even in the midst of all this chaos and grief, there's still this underlying order.
Exactly. It's like a framework, giving some shape to all that raw emotion.
I like that.
And the third lament, the one right in the middle, takes this structure even further.
Oh, how so?
So it still has 22 units like the first two, but each unit is made up of 3 lines. And all 3 lines within each unit start with the same letter of the alphabet in order. So like 3 lines starting with Aleph, then 3 with Beth, and so on. You see this kind of thing in Psalm 119 too.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, that's intricate.
It is, and what it tells us is that this wasn't just a spontaneous outpouring, This was carefully crafted poetry. Really thoughtful.
Yeah, it's amazing how much thought and care went into structuring these laments, even though they're about such difficult, raw subjects. Now, the fifth lament, is that structured the same way?
It's a little different. It still has 22 lines, which keeps that connection to the alphabet, but it doesn't follow the strict acrostic pattern like the others.
Okay, so it's like a variation on the theme.
Yeah, exactly. The framework is still there, but it's not quite as rigid. But the big takeaway here is this. Lamentation, it's not just raw emotion. It's poetry, artfully crafted.
It's almost like they're using the alphabet itself to hold all the pieces of their broken world.
That's a great way to put it.
So you mentioned before that lamenting as a type of writing, it shows up other places in the Old Testament. Like, where else do we see it?
Oh yeah, it's definitely not unique to Lamentations. You see it a lot in the songs. Tons of songs are all about sorrow and grief and crying out to God for help. And the prophets, too, often lament the people's sins and the judgments that are coming.
Okay, but what makes Lamentations different?
Well, it's the only book in the entire Old Testament that's entirely focused on lament.
Oh, interesting. So it's like pure, undiluted grief.
Exactly. It's not mixed with praise or thanksgiving or prophecy like you see in other places. It's just lament, start to finish.
Wow, that's intense. The source material also mentions some interesting parallels with ancient writings from outside the Bible. Like, what's the connection there?
Yeah, that's a good point. It helps us understand how common this kind of writing was in the ancient world. So there are these Sumerian laments about the destruction of their cities, like Ur and Nippur.
Okay.
And they have a really similar tone to Lamentations, focusing on the devastation, how a once great city is now in ruins. And often they say it's because the gods were angry.
So it was like a shared way of processing these huge losses.
Yeah, it seems like it. Lamenting a city's destruction was a way for people to express their collective grief, to try to make sense of what happened.
It's almost like a universal language of grief, in a way. And it's not just an ancient thing either, is it? The material says Lamentations is still important in Jewish and Christian traditions today.
Oh, absolutely. In Orthodox Judaism, for example, they read the entire Book of Lamentations out loud on Tisha B'Av. That's the 9th day of the month of Aviv in the Hebrew calendar. And it's a major day of mourning, remembering the destruction of both the first temple in 586 BC and the second temple in 70 AD. A lot of people also recite Lamentations at the Western Wall in Jerusalem every week.
Right, that last remaining wall of the second temple.
Exactly. So it's still a really powerful and relevant text for Jewish identity and memory. And in the Roman Catholic Church, they use Lamentations during Holy Week, the 3 days leading up to Easter.
Oh, wow. So they connect the suffering of Jerusalem to the suffering of Christ.
Right, and it highlights how this book can speak to different kinds of loss and suffering, across time, across cultures. So let's dive into the actual themes of the book. Not surprisingly, destruction is a big one. What does Lamentations tell us about the aftermath of Jerusalem's fall?
Yeah, let's get into that.
Well, it's pretty brutal, to be honest. Lamentations doesn't shy away from the realities of war and conquest in the ancient world. It describes the destruction in really graphic detail, showing how it affected every level of society, from the king all the way down to the everyday people. No one was spared.
Yeah, the material you sent has some really stark examples, like Kings and princes, they were humiliated. The elders and priests lost all their authority and respect. Even the prophets were persecuted. It's a complete breakdown of society.
Yeah, total collapse. And it's not just social and political either. The physical and emotional toll is just devastating.
Yeah, that part is really hard to read.
It is. Like, there's this description of starving mothers resorting to cannibalism to survive the siege. Can you imagine?
Oh, that's awful.
And then all the young and able-bodied people that were forced into exile, which was a huge blow to their identity, their whole sense of who they were as a people.
Right, it would have been like ripping apart the fabric of their society.
And of course, the temple, their most sacred space, was completely destroyed. That meant the end of all their ceremonies, their rituals, everything that was at the heart of their relationship with God.
So it's a picture of complete devastation on every level. But the book doesn't just describe the suffering, right? It tries to make sense of it, to figure out why it happened. And that brings us to this big theme of divine judgment.
Yes, exactly. This is really key to understanding Lamentations. The book doesn't say that the destruction was just because the Babylonians were stronger. It says that God was behind it, that he allowed it to happen.
So they're saying it was God's will.
Right. They believed that the Babylonians were just a tool, an instrument in God's hand.
Wow. And why would God do that? I mean, was there a reason?
Oh, yeah. Lamentations is very clear about that. The reason for God's judgment was the people's sin. Their rebellion against his commands, their breaking of the covenant he had made with them.
So they saw this destruction as a consequence of their actions.
Exactly. It wasn't random or meaningless. It was a direct result of their turning away from God. Like Lamentations 1.5 says, their captivity was because of their many transgressions. And 1.89 talks about how their transgressions had multiplied. And then in 4.13, it even blames the prophets and priests, saying that their sins contributed to the city's downfall.
Wow. They're taking responsibility. It's not just, oh, poor us, this terrible thing happened. It's, we messed up, and this is what happened because of it.
Exactly. And that recognition, I think, is really powerful. It shows a deep level of honesty and self-reflection.
Yeah. So we've got this picture of total devastation and the understanding that it's God's judgment because of their sin. That's pretty bleak. But is there any hope in this book?
That's a great question. And yes, there is hope. It doesn't end with despair.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it really doesn't, because even though it acknowledges how bad things are, how severe God's judgment is, Lamentations also points to the possibility of repentance and restoration.
Okay, so they're saying, like, we messed up, but we can still turn things around.
Right, and they emphasize the importance of truly recognizing their wrongdoing, of feeling genuine remorse, of repenting. And they also talk about the need to keep trusting in God even when things are really dark.
Remember that he's still merciful, still faithful.
Exactly. And there's this incredible shift that happens in chapter 3, the one right in the middle of the book. The material you sent called it the theological apex of Lamentations.
Okay, why is that?
Well, it's where things start to turn, emotionally and spiritually. It's where the seeds of hope are planted. So the author is still lamenting, still complaining to God, but then there's this powerful affirmation of God's goodness.
So they're like, God, you're punishing us and it's awful, but also you are good.
Yeah, something like that. It's like they're holding both truths at the same time. Like in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 3, it says, "It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness."
Wow, that's beautiful.
It is. It's a powerful statement of faith in the face of utter devastation. And it's saying that even when things seem completely hopeless, God's mercy and faithfulness are still there.
So even in the midst of judgment, God's love is still present.
Yes, exactly. And this hope that starts to emerge in chapter 3, it doesn't just sit there passively.
Okay, so it leads to something.
Yeah, it fuels this plea for restoration. Like in chapter 5, there's this direct appeal to God for forgiveness and for a chance to rebuild their relationship. And even though it's still a lament, there's this affirmation that God is still on his throne, that his reign hasn't ended.
So they're saying, like, God, you're still in control, even though everything seems like it's falling apart.
Right. It's a reminder that even when things are really bad, God's power and authority haven't disappeared. He's still there.
So it's this really intense journey, isn't it? Starting with despair and the recognition of sin, and then moving towards this fragile hope that's grounded in God's faithfulness and mercy. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's recap how each chapter unfolds. The material you sent has a nice outline.
Sounds good.
Okay, so chapter 1, that's where we get the picture of Jerusalem's suffering, right?
Yeah, chapter 1 is all about Jerusalem's misery and desolation. It's like, here's the city, here's the pain, here's the feeling of being abandoned.
Right, right. Then chapter 2, that's where the focus shifts to God, right?
Yeah, chapter 2 is about God's anger, his judgment on his people. And it shows how that judgment played out in the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay. Then chapter 3, that's the turning point we talked about, right? Where the lament gets really intense, but then hope starts to peek through.
Exactly. Chapter 3 is where Judah complains to God, but it's also where they find a basis for consolation.
Okay. Chapter 4.
Chapter 4 compares the glory of Jerusalem's past with the shame of its present. It's like, look at what we once were, and look at what we've become.
A stark contrast. And finally, chapter 5.
Chapter 5 is a direct appeal to God for forgiveness and restoration. It's a plea for mercy, a hope for a new future.
So it's a journey full of pain and honesty and ultimately a flicker of hope. As we wrap up this deep dive into Lamentations, what are the big takeaways? What do you want our listeners to walk away with?
Okay, well, first, I think it's important to appreciate how raw and honest this book is. It's a powerful expression of grief, of what it feels like to experience incredible loss. Second, we can't forget that it's also a work of art. The way it's written, the structure, the language, it's beautiful and powerful. Third, Lamentations gives us a way to understand tragedy from a theological perspective. It says that the destruction of Jerusalem was God's judgment, a consequence of sin.
Right, but like you said before, it doesn't end with despair.
Exactly, and that's the fourth takeaway. Lamentations also emphasizes repentance, turning back to God. And it shows us that even in the darkest times, there's still hope, because God's mercy and faithfulness never run out.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So for you listening out there, even though this book is ancient, the things it talks about loss, questioning faith, finding hope when things are really hard, those things are still so relevant today. We all go through difficult times, times that can make us feel lost and broken.
Yeah, and sometimes it could be really helpful to read about other people who have been through those same kinds of things, even if it was thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it can help us feel less alone. So here's something to think about as you go about your day. How do we deal with suffering, whether it's personal or something that affects a whole community? How do we make sense of it in light of a God who is supposed to be loving and just? Does Lamentations give us any clues? Does its honesty, its willingness to even question God, give us a way to grapple with those big questions while still holding on to hope?
Yeah, those are really good questions, ones worth wrestling with.
For sure.